The Arizona sun spilled through the wide slats of the shutters, casting quiet stripes of gold across the ceramic floor tiles. In the heart of a sun-drenched neighborhood on the edge of Scottsdale, nestled among the desert sage and low adobe homes, lived a woman whom most of the world had stopped noticing. Her name was Nora Whitaker, and she was 76 years old. She had a strong gait for her age, and though time had thinned her white hair and carved lines across her once youthful face, her voice still carried the calm authority of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms and resolving schoolyard chaos. For 32 years, Nora had been the principal of Desert Vista Elementary School. Her days used to be filled with chalk dust, budget meetings, and careful negotiations between demanding parents and overwhelmed teachers. Now they were quieter, though no less deliberate. Her home was modest but warm, filled with relics of a life shaped by duty. A rusted bell from her old school desk sat near her fireplace. Photos of her late husband, Robert, smiled from oak frames. Bookshelves lined with novels and educational manuals wrapped around the living room like an embrace. There was peace in her solitude, but not always rest. It had been 5 years since Nora made the decision that still shaped every quiet moment she now lived through. It began on a Tuesday night, like most stories that change your life often do, with an unannounced knock and a voice cracked by panic. Her daughter, Vivian, stood on her doorstep, mascara running down her cheeks, hands trembling around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. Craig, her husband, waited in the car, his engine still running. Vivian couldn't form full sentences, not at first. She talked in pieces, about business failures, investment losses, and a looming threat of foreclosure on the home they had bought just 2 years before with such fanfare. The mortgage payment of $4,250 had become insurmountable. They were 3 months behind, and the bank had stopped answering their calls. Nora, ever the mother, didn't ask too many questions. She made tea, sat Vivian down, and promised to look into it. That night, Nora called Zara Lopez, her financial advisor of 15 years, the woman Robert had handpicked when they'd started planning retirement. Zara had always been cautious, never chasing trends or making grand promises. Robert had liked that. So did Nora. By Friday, they had a plan. It was simple and clean. Nora would create a limited liability company, Sunrise Solutions LLC, that would legally buy the mortgage from the bank. Vivian and Craig would continue making their monthly payments as if they were paying a credit union. They would retain their dignity, never knowing that it was Nora quietly supplementing their shortfall each month, $3,000 to cover the difference between what they paid and what was owed. If they ever defaulted, Nora would become the legal owner. But she never thought it would come to that. She did it not for control or recognition, but because she believed, truly believed, that family should never feel alone in their lowest moment. For 5 years, she kept it secret. Each month, Nora would sit at her kitchen counter with her laptop open and quietly transfer money from her retirement account into the Sunrise Solutions ledger. She tracked every payment, every receipt, in color-coded spreadsheets. Her training as a principal had made her meticulous. She never brought it up. Not at birthdays, not on Christmas. Not even when Craig boasted about the remodeled kitchen or the new chandelier Vivian had picked out from a design magazine. Nora smiled and nodded, accepting their praise for the wise refinancing deal they thought they'd secured on their own. But beneath that quiet, a soft ache grew. She didn't feel resentment, at least, not at first. There was something deeply satisfying about helping them without their pride getting in the way. And yet, with each passing holiday, each skipped thank you, each offhand remark about her being set for life, or too frugal to enjoy anything, Nora began to feel a weight not of dollars, but of dismissal. It wasn't until her grandson, Tyler, pulled her aside during his college graduation party, away from the crowd, to a quiet bench near the pool, that Nora realized just how much she had let herself disappear. He had a phone in his hand. His knuckles were white. "Grandma," he whispered, looking almost ashamed, "I need you to see this. You deserve to know." And in that moment, everything shifted. But this isn't the moment we're focusing on today. That comes later. What matters now is the stillness before the storm. The 5 long years where Nora, like so many older women the world tends to overlook, lived in the shadow of her own sacrifices. She drove herself to the water aerobics class 3 times a week. She volunteered twice a month at the library, reading stories to children whose parents were always too late to pick them up. She attended book club every second Thursday, where everyone drank cheap Chardonnay and half of them never finished the book. She lived her life. And she waited. She waited for someone to notice, not the money, but the effort, the intention, the weight she carried so they didn't have to. Her neighbors thought she was just that nice widow with the quiet voice and great garden. Even Vivian, her own daughter, thought Nora had nothing else to do but bake cookies and attend community potlucks. And maybe that was what hurt most of all. Not the lack of gratitude, but the erasure of her complexity. Because Nora was not some relic to be stored politely in the corner of family gatherings. She was a woman who had spent her youth standing in front of unruly classrooms, advocating for children who had no other champion. She had buried the love of her life at 69 and didn't let grief turn her bitter. She had navigated taxes, insurance, estate planning, and investments on her own. She had kept receipts, both literal and emotional. She had always been more than what they saw. And still she gave. Because she believed love wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. It didn't require acknowledgement or applause. It existed in grocery runs and mortgage supplements, in staying silent so others could keep their heads high, in waiting by the phone for a call that never came. Until one night it did. It was a text. From Tyler. Just 3 lines long. "Grandma, I'm sorry. You need to see this." She tapped play. She watched. She listened. And as her daughter's voice filled the room with words like burden and useless, something inside Nora shifted. Not broken, not shattered. Hardened. Clarified. Love may be quiet. But sometimes, silence is not kindness. Sometimes, silence is enabling cruelty. She closed the laptop, pushed her tea aside, and opened the spreadsheet again. 5 years of sacrifice. $183,750 documented line by line. Her spine straightened. Because the thing about carrying a family quietly is that one day, you might need to stand tall and remind them who really held them up. It was nearly midnight when Nora's phone vibrated on the nightstand beside her bed. She was half asleep, the soft ticking of her antique wall clock accompanying her drifting thoughts. The desert air was unusually still, not even the creak of the saguaro outside her window to interrupt the silence. She reached for the phone, squinting at the screen without her glasses. Tyler, 11:42 p.m. "Grandma, I'm sorry, but you need to see this." Her stomach sank. Tyler was never careless with words. He was measured, thoughtful. The kind of young man who carried his silence like a weight, only breaking it when something mattered. She hesitated for a moment, then tapped the message. A video file loaded. It began without ceremony. A kitchen. Laughter. The faint clink of wine glasses. Then her daughter's voice, Vivian's, filled the room. Nora sat up slowly, the bed creaking beneath her. She turned up the volume. "She's practically useless now. God, the woman does nothing to help." Vivian was lounging at the kitchen island of the Spanish colonial home Nora had saved from foreclosure 5 years ago. She recognized the marble countertops, the brass fixtures she had indirectly paid for. Vivian sipped from a half-full wine glass, her voice slurred just slightly with the ease of comfort, not intoxication. "After everything we've done for her," she added, rolling her eyes. "The grocery runs, the doctor appointments. Honestly, she should at least sell that beach condo. She never uses it. What's the point of holding on to it like some shrine?" Nora's breath caught. The video continued. Craig leaned into the frame next, his smirk as familiar as it was infuriating. "Shows us, after all we've sacrificed. That woman would be out on the street if it weren't for us." They laughed. Melissa, their daughter, Nora's granddaughter, sat silently at the far end of the frame. She didn't laugh. She didn't interrupt. She simply nodded. "She acts like picking up milk is this massive favor," Vivian continued. "Meanwhile, we're drowning in bills, and she's just sitting on all that money like some dusty old dragon." Nora watched in silence as her daughter spoke about her as though she were a burden, An obligation, a transaction gone stale. And she realized something brutal. They had no idea. They didn't know that for 5 years, Nora had transferred $3,000 every month into Sunrise Solutions LLC, covering what Vivian and Craig thought was a refinance with a generous credit union. They didn't know that she, not a bank, had kept the foreclosure notices at bay. That her frugal lifestyle, her careful budget, her reused tea bags and mended sweaters had funded their illusion of comfort. She pressed pause. Her hands were shaking, not with rage, but with something colder, quieter. She played the video again. And again. A third time. By the fourth viewing, her chest felt hollowed out. On the fifth, it hardened. Nora didn't sleep that night. Instead, she moved to the kitchen, her slippers whispering softly against the tile. The kettle hissed. The aroma of chamomile filled the room. But she let the tea go cold, untouched. She opened her laptop. Spreadsheet tabs bloomed across the screen, every payment cataloged. 5 years. $183,750. Each row color-coded. Each line a lifeline she had extended while they joked behind her back about her irrelevance. The numbers didn't lie. Neither did the video. She could have confronted them right away. Could have called Vivian and demanded an explanation. Could have told Craig that his smug entitlement was built on the back of her silent generosity. But something in her shifted that night, something final. She remembered a phrase Robert used to say when he was teaching their daughter how to budget. Never drive a car you can't afford to maintain. Never build a life you can't sustain with integrity. They hadn't just taken her money. They'd spent it with disdain. They had insulted her in the same rooms she'd helped preserve. They had planned dinners with her while scheming to take her condo, her assets, her dignity. And the worst part wasn't even their betrayal. It was the fact that, deep down, Nora realized she had allowed it. She had taught hundreds of students over decades to advocate for themselves, to recognize toxic behavior, to not let others define their worth. But she had failed to take her own advice. Until now. At 6:10 a.m., as the first blush of sunrise painted the Sonoran desert in hues of lavender and rose, Nora composed an email. To Zara Lopez. Subject: Urgent Mortgage Option Clause. We need to talk. It's time. By 6:45 a.m., Zara had called. Her voice was steady as always. But there was an undertone of concern. What happened, Nora? Nora relayed everything. The video, the words, the years of silence, the ledger of unacknowledged support. Zara didn't interrupt. When Nora finished, there was a beat of silence. I was hoping this day wouldn't come, Zara said softly, but I've kept everything ready just in case. Are you saying I'm legally protected? Nora asked, watching a hummingbird flit past her window. Absolutely. The option to purchase clause is valid. If they default, which technically they already have by not fulfilling the full monthly obligation, you can initiate full ownership. They become tenants at will. No confrontation required? None, Zara confirmed. They'll receive formal notice once the next payment deadline passes and your portion is not supplemented. The system will automatically trigger default procedures. Nora breathed in deeply. The desert air smelled faintly of creosote and clarity. I don't want revenge, she whispered. You're not getting revenge, Nora, Zara said. You're asserting boundaries. That afternoon, Nora sat in her sunroom and drafted a letter to herself. Not to be sent. Not to be shown. Just a document of truth. To the woman who forgot her own worth. You gave in silence for 5 years. You held the roof over their heads while they mocked your name. You allowed their comfort to come at the cost of your pride. And even when they called you a burden, you didn't scream. You wrote it down. You remembered. And now you reclaim what's yours, not out of spite, but out of love for yourself. It's time. She signed it with the same looping cursive she'd used to sign diplomas for 3 decades. Nora stood up. And she began to plan, not an attack, but a restoration. She wouldn't yell. She wouldn't plead. She would act. Quietly. Completely. The Arizona air was thick with heat, even as the sun began its slow descent beyond the red cliffs of the horizon. In Nora's backyard, the cacti stood like ancient sentinels, unmoved, unblinking. Inside, the smell of roasted chicken, rosemary, and baked squash filled the house. It was Sunday, dinner day. Vivian had invited Nora over with her usual sweetness, forced, but carefully wrapped in a hallmark smile. "Just the family, Mom," she'd said. "We'd love for you to come. It's been a while since we all sat down together." Nora had known something was off. Tyler's video had shattered the illusion. And though she hadn't confronted anyone yet, she had been watching, listening, with new ears. So she went, wearing the same navy blouse and beige slacks she always did, letting them believe she hadn't changed. Because tonight she needed to know. The house gleamed more than usual. Fresh flowers on the table. Imported wine breathing in a crystal decanter. Melissa kissed her cheek like always, her hug practiced. Craig was pouring wine, overly cheerful. Vivian's eyes sparkled too much for a casual dinner. And yet, none of them knew what she already knew. Dinner unfolded with well-rehearsed ease. Melissa gushed about a new client for her photography business. Craig regaled everyone with the usual jargon about market corrections and portfolio diversification. Vivian complimented Nora's book club updates, though she had never asked about it before. Then, dessert arrived. Chocolate mousse in glass ramekins. Pomade. Over the top. Vivian placed hers in front of Nora, smile just a little too tight. Then she reached across the table, placing a manicured hand atop her mother's. "Mom, we need to talk about something. Something important." Nora looked up, gaze steady. Craig leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table like a news anchor preparing to break a tragic story with empathy. "We're worried about you," he said. Vivian nodded quickly. "Just little things. Forgetting appointments. That time you misplaced your checkbook. You've always been so organized, but lately—" Nora said nothing. Craig continued, "We think it might be time to take a closer look at your finances. Just to make sure everything is in order." Melissa sipped her wine. Avoided Nora's eyes. Vivian squeezed her mother's hand. "Connor, our financial advisor, he's reviewed some of your public asset filings. He's concerned." There was a rehearsed trap, like students practicing lines for a school play. Nora set her spoon down quietly. "And what exactly is Connor concerned about?" Craig stepped in. He said that, given your age and the value of your estate, it might be prudent to consider consolidating your accounts. That way, we can assist you in managing things. Before mistakes happen. "Before mistakes happen," Nora repeated, her voice soft and level. "I see." Vivian tried again. "It's not that we think you can't handle it. It's just that things are complicated now. Tax laws, digital security. These aren't simple times." "And what would you suggest?" Nora asked. Her hands were calm, resting on her lap. "Power of attorney?" Vivian blinked. "Only if that makes sense. Or maybe a co-signer on the condo. It's just, it would give us peace of mind." "Peace of mind?" Nora breathed in slowly. "Is that what this is about? The beach condo?" Craig interjected too quickly. "It's not about the property, Nora. It's about making sure you're safe. Stable. If something happened to you tomorrow—" "I'm sorry," Nora said gently. "Are you planning to make something happen to me tomorrow?" Craig froze. Vivian's smile cracked for a moment. "Mom." Nora stood. "Excuse me. I need the restroom." She didn't go to the restroom. She went down the hallway instead, where the doors were closed. One door in particular, their home office, had been left slightly ajar. From within, she could hear voices. Two of them. She paused outside, quiet as breath. Connor and Melissa. Her granddaughter's voice came first, low and tight. She didn't bite. She's still holding back. Connor's reply was steady. "Then we move to phase 2. We present the paperwork. We emphasize the risks. If she won't consent, there are other ways." Melissa hesitated. "You mean guardianship?" "Technically, it's called conservatorship here. Arizona law allows for expedited processes when there's financial impairment involved." "But what if she fights it?" "Then we document everything. Her resistance. Any erratic behavior. The beach condo is worth nearly $500,000. We can't let her mismanage it just because she's sentimentally attached to it. She's my grandmother. Connor sighed. And your future. Think of it that way. Nora's heart pounded. The walls felt suddenly closer. This wasn't just manipulation. This was a plan. Not just Craig. Not just Vivian. Melissa. Her sweet, quiet Melissa. She didn't confront them. She didn't make a sound. She turned and walked back to the dining room with a calm, controlled grace that only years of principalship could have taught her. Back at the table, she sat down, picked up her spoon, stirred the mousse. Vivian smiled too eagerly. Are you all right, Mom? Nora smiled back, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yes, darling. Just a bit lightheaded. Age, you know. Craig chuckled. Exactly what we're worried about. Nora nodded. And I'm so grateful. Truly. I'll think about everything we discussed. Vivian looked satisfied. Of course. No pressure. Just think it over. I will, Nora said. I always think before I act. That night, as they waved her off, Nora drove home in silence. The desert darkness wrapped around her Camry like a familiar friend. But inside, Nora was ablaze. Her mind raced, not with anger, but with clarity. They weren't just trying to guilt her. They were planning to strip her identity, her control, her legacy. They saw her not as a person but as a path to wealth. They thought her silence meant weakness. They didn't understand the power of someone who had spent her life watching others, listening, waiting. Someone who had learned how to hold the line. At home, she opened her filing cabinet and pulled out the Sunrise Solutions contract. She placed it next to a new file folder labeled Action Plan. She then opened her planner. A single date circled. June 15th, mortgage payment due. 13 days left. 13 days until they'd understand exactly who they had underestimated. The first Monday after that dinner passed like any other in Nora's quiet home. The hummingbirds returned to the feeder outside her sunroom, darting and diving with their usual fury. Her tea steeped in its favorite porcelain mug, the one with the faded painting of a lighthouse Robert had given her on their 40th anniversary. But something fundamental had changed. The stillness was the same, but Nora's mind was not. She had spent nearly a lifetime believing in endurance, emotional grace, quiet generosity, the long-suffering love of mothers. She had held her tongue when it trembled to speak. She had smiled when Vivian canceled Sunday visits last minute. She had overlooked Craig's arrogance, his dismissiveness, his thinly veiled condescension. She had swallowed every thankless glance, every backhanded compliment, every assumption that she was just a tired old woman with too many cats and too little relevance. But now the illusion had ruptured, and she could see everything clearly. They didn't just underestimate her. They relied on her not fighting back. And that had been her greatest mistake. Not in helping, but in disappearing. Zara arrived at Nora's house that Tuesday morning, her black slacks perfectly pressed, her folder already open before she sat down. I've reviewed everything again, she said, glasses sliding slightly down her nose. Your legal footing is rock solid. Once the payment deadline hits and your contribution isn't added, it automatically triggers the default clause. They'll receive a notice within 48 hours. Nora nodded. And then, you'll be the full legal owner of the property. They'll technically become tenants at will, month-to-month residents without lease protection. Arizona statutes allow a 30-day notice to vacate. We'll file it the moment the default kicks in. Will I need to see them? She asked quietly. Not unless you want to. We can handle it entirely through the sheriff's office and certified mail. But, Zara hesitated. But, you might consider telling them yourself. Not for their sake. For yours. You've spent 5 years protecting them from their reality. Maybe it's time they heard it from you. Nora let her fingers trace the lip of her tea mug. The idea felt foreign. She had always used her silence as her sword. But silence had only let the rot grow louder. That night, Nora opened the drawer of her writing desk and pulled out Robert's journal. It had been 8 years since he passed. Quietly, swiftly, one soft breath between sleep and stillness. Inside the cover, she found his familiar handwriting. When the time comes, Nora, Don't be afraid to say what needs to be said. Kindness should never cost you your dignity. She closed the journal. Her spine straightened. On Friday, she texted Vivian. Dinner this Sunday at my house. Just the four of us. I have something to discuss. The reply came fast. Of course, Mo. Anything you need. Red heart. Nora stared at the heart emoji, her jaw clenched. The performance would continue until the curtain dropped. Sunday came with an eerie calm. The table was set with Robert's old china, ivory porcelain with thin gold rims. Nora made his favorite roast chicken, garlic potatoes, and the peach cobbler Vivian used to beg for in high school. It wasn't for nostalgia. It was for contrast. She wanted them to remember who she was when they finally saw her clearly. They arrived at 5:02 p.m. Vivian in a floral blouse that screamed effort. Craig in a golf polo. Melissa trailing behind with a forced smile and a gift bag, perfume, Nora would guess. She didn't open it. They made small talk, complimented the table, the food, the lighting. Nora nodded, played along, poured sparkling water into her own glass while the others reached for wine. Dinner passed uneventfully, each bite a countdown. As the last fork settled on the last plate, Nora rose. Her voice was steady. I need you to follow me into the living room. 3 sets of eyes blinked up at her. Now please. They settled onto the couch, still smiling nervously. Craig's arm rested along the back of the couch behind Vivian's shoulders. Melissa sat closest to the window, fingers laced, silent. Nora placed a manila folder on the coffee table between them. Inside was the full documentation of the mortgage, every contract, every payment, every clause, neatly tabbed and annotated. She didn't sit. I created Sunrise Solutions 5 years ago, she began. When you came to me crying, Vivian, when you were 3 months behind on your mortgage and facing foreclosure. The smiles faded. I bought the debt. Every month, I added $3,000 to the $1,250 you believed was your full payment. For 5 years. Quietly. Willingly. Craig started to speak, but Nora raised her hand. I never told you because I thought you needed your pride. I wanted to protect your sense of control. I believed, wrongly, that love meant sacrificing recognition. She paused. And then I saw the video. Silence fell like a stone. Vivian's face went pale. What video? She asked, voice trembling. Tyler sent it to me. The one where you called me a burden. A waste. A woman who owes you for picking up groceries. Craig scoffed. That was just venting, Nora. People say things they don't mean. No, Nora said, her tone steely. People say things they mean when they believe no one is listening. Vivian's eyes welled with tears. Mom, we were stressed. And then there was the conversation with Connor. Nora cut in. The plan to declare me mentally unfit so you could take over my finances. The condo. My autonomy. Melissa looked down at her lap, ashamed. I've taught children for 3 decades, Nora said, voice rising slightly. I know manipulation when I see it. I know entitlement. I know betrayal. She placed a final document on the table. This is the 30-day eviction notice. Effective as soon as the mortgage defaults tomorrow. Vivian gasped. You're kicking us out of our home? No, Nora replied. I'm reclaiming what I've paid for. What I own. And what you've shown, repeatedly, that you do not respect. Melissa whispered, Grandma. Nora turned to her, her voice softer. I paid your college tuition. Your rent. I covered the cost of your first car. I never asked for anything in return. But you sat there in silence while they plotted to strip me of my freedom. Vivian was openly crying now. We didn't mean to hurt you. No, Nora said. You meant to use me. She picked up the manila folder. And I've decided I'm done being used. They left soon after. No hugs, no handshakes. Vivian tried once more at the door. We can work this out. Please, don't do this. Nora's reply was firm. This is me working it out. As the door closed behind them, the silence returned. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Nora walked to the sunroom and sat with her tea, watching the shadows stretch long across the desert. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone's burden. She felt like herself, unapologetically. The house stood quiet for 3 weeks after they left. Nora had changed the locks the day after the movers came and went, leaving behind an echo of footsteps, a few forgotten coffee mugs, and silence, the kind of silence that holds grief in one hand and resolve in the other. She visited once, just to stand in the living room. Her footsteps were soft on the hardwood floors, and the walls, stripped bare of family photos, seemed to breathe easier. The air was clean now, no hidden agendas, no resentment. Just space. At 76, Nora never expected to start over. But maybe, she thought, starting over wasn't about beginning again. Maybe it was about starting right. She walked through the house slowly, touching the kitchen counter she had unknowingly paid for, the new crown molding they never thanked her for, the custom-built bench by the window she once read stories to Melissa on. It could have remained an empty house, a reminder of betrayal. But Nora had been a builder her whole life, not of homes, but of people. And she wasn't done yet. The idea came during one of her early morning walks. She'd always passed the little bench near Tatum Park, where an older gentleman in a red Cardinals cap sat reading every Thursday morning. This time, she stopped and spoke. His name was Arnold. He was 81, a retired firefighter. Widowed like her. His daughter lived 2 states away and visited when she could. They talked about the weather, books, and aching knees. But beneath his calm smile, Nora recognized it, loneliness. It wrapped around his sentences like static. Not loud, but unmistakable. That afternoon, she made 2 phone calls. The first, to her lawyer. The second, to Tyler. "I think it's beautiful, Grandma," Tyler said when she told him. She sat across from him in a small booth at Bellini's diner, a plate of waffles cooling between them. "I just don't want to do it alone," she admitted. "You won't." His answer was immediate. Nora blinked away the heat behind her eyes. Not from sadness. From gratitude. Within weeks, she converted the title of the home into a non-profit LLC, the Copperwood Center for Dignity and Aging. Her vision wasn't a care facility. It wasn't institutional. It was a place where older adults could breathe again. A place for those who'd been quietly forgotten, who had stories to share, skills to teach, lives still full of meaning. She started small. She hosted coffee mornings. 3 people showed up the first week. Then 5. Then 12. She cleared out the old dining room and turned it into a workshop space. Tyler brought in donated laptops. Nora printed flyers. Tech help for seniors, learn to FaceTime your grandkids. A woman named Grace came every Tuesday to play piano. Hank, a retired carpenter, offered to teach basic woodworking. The empty garage became his domain, full of sawdust, laughter, and second chances. One afternoon, Nora received a handwritten letter. "Dear Ms. Whitaker, I've lived 2 blocks away from your center for nearly 20 years. I just wanted to thank you. My father, Jim, hasn't left the house in months. Since his wife passed, he stopped smiling. But this week, he came home from your book club and asked me if we could go shopping for a new pair of slacks. You gave me a piece of him back. Thank you. Elena." Nora read it twice. Then framed it. Because no part of her life as a mother, wife, or educator, not even her decades as principal, had felt quite as purposeful as this. She was creating something not for legacy, but for healing. One day, months into running the center, Nora stood in the old master bedroom, what was now her office, and looked out across the backyard. The garden Craig once criticized as too much maintenance had transformed into a communal space. Tomato plants lined the fence. A new picnic table sat beneath a fig tree she had almost cut down. That afternoon, an elderly woman with a cane approached her at the community table. "Are you the one who owns the place?" she asked. Nora nodded. "I guess I am." The woman sat slowly. Her voice was soft but sturdy. "I want to thank you. I've been to so many places where they treat us like we're in the way. Here, I feel like a person." Nora didn't say anything at first. She just smiled, because she understood exactly what the woman meant. That was the moment she knew this had never been about revenge. Not really. It had been about rediscovery, turning betrayal into purpose. hurt into healing. She did see Vivian again, once. It was at the grocery store, nearly a year later. Vivian looked tired, her hair unstyled, her clothes wrinkled. Craig was nowhere in sight. They made eye contact in the cereal aisle. Vivian walked over slowly. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Vivian." There was a pause, thick and awkward. "I heard what you did with the house," Vivian said, voice low. "It's a good thing." Nora gave a small nod. "It is. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Nora looked at her daughter. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "I accept your apology, Vivian. But I won't reopen that chapter. Not the same way." Vivian nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I understand." And Nora walked away, not with anger, but with peace. Months later, a local news outlet ran a feature on the Copperwood Center. They called Nora the grandmother of second chances. The article ended with her quote, "You don't need to be young to start something that matters. You just need to believe you're not done giving yet." And in the quiet of the sunroom that evening, with hummingbirds fluttering outside her window and the smell of fresh banana bread in the air, Nora finally felt something she hadn't in years. Not because she was needed, but because she chose herself, and then used her freedom to lift others. There was a time when Nora Whitaker didn't know her own strength. Not because she didn't possess it, but because she had spent so much of her life giving it away. In raising Vivian. In managing a school. In smoothing over conflict, choosing the quiet path, telling herself that grace meant silence. She had believed, like many women of her generation, that to love was to sacrifice, and to be strong was to do so without asking for acknowledgement. That belief had shaped her. For decades, it was her compass. Until the compass failed her. Until the very people she sacrificed for mistook her kindness for weakness. But what followed, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the reclaiming of her home and identity, had lit something inside Nora that no one, not even herself, had expected. Defiance. It started subtly. The first time she stood in front of a group of seniors at the Copperwood Center and introduced a new program, Writing Your Own Legacy, her hands shook. She hadn't spoken publicly in years, not since retirement. But her voice, clear and resonant, carried with surprising ease across the room. She spoke not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman reborn in the truth of who she was. "We spend so much of our lives being defined by others," she said, eyes scanning the crowd. "By our children, our careers, our roles. But who are you when no one's looking? That's the story I want you to write. That's the version of you that matters most." The room fell silent. A retired nurse in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. A former mechanic nodded slowly. A Vietnam vet in the back cracked a rare smile. Nora didn't know it then, but in that moment, she became more than a founder. She became a leader again. A symbol. The community began to shift around her. A young city council member reached out after reading about her work. "We need someone like you on our advisory board for senior policy," she said. "Your voice matters." Nora paused, surprised. "My voice? After all this time?" The woman smiled. "Especially after all this time." And just like that, Nora stepped into a new role, one she had never imagined in her 70s. A voice at the table. A decision maker. A force. She advocated for accessible transportation for elderly citizens, pushed for more transparency in elder conservatorship cases, and spoke out against ageist assumptions that still lingered in policy meetings like cobwebs on ceiling fans. The same woman who had once been called a burden by her own daughter now found herself surrounded by people who listened when she spoke, who waited for her perspective, who quoted her in public meetings. But Nora's transformation wasn't just about the world seeing her differently. It was about how she now saw herself. There was a stillness she carried now, but not the stillness of defeat. It was the calm of someone who had walked through fire barefoot and had come out knowing where every coal was placed. She no longer tolerated condescension. Not from strangers. Not from family. Not even from herself. One afternoon, while reviewing budget proposals for the center, Melissa, her granddaughter, showed up unannounced. They hadn't spoken in months. Melissa looked thinner. Her usually styled hair was pulled into a simple ponytail. Her eyes, so much like Vivian's, held something Nora hadn't seen in years: humility. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. Nora hesitated, then nodded. They sat in the garden, where the new community mural was being painted by local high school students, under the fig tree. "I wanted to apologize again," Melissa began. "I've been going to therapy. I'm learning a lot about myself. About how we treated you." Nora watched a hummingbird flit between blooms. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Melissa said, "but I do want to earn your respect again. However long that takes." Nora turned to her. "You want my respect?" Melissa nodded. "Then start by respecting yourself first," Nora said. "When you do that, you stop letting people tell you what value you hold, and you never again steal it from someone else." Melissa cried then, not performatively, not with shame, but with something deeper: understanding. And Nora reached out and took her hand. Because growth doesn't always mean burning bridges. Sometimes, it means building better ones. Nora's days became filled with purpose again. Not obligation, not expectation, but intention. She woke early, still, but now for morning journaling sessions with residents. On Thursdays, she hosted a story circle, where seniors took turns recounting memories, big and small. Laughter often filled the room. Sometimes tears. But always truth. In one session, Arnold, the retired firefighter, shared how he hadn't spoken about his wife's death in 7 years, until Nora created a space where grief was allowed to exist beside joy. "You remind us that we're not done yet," he said, voice shaking. "That we're still allowed to matter." Nora smiled, her heart heavy and light all at once. She hadn't set out to become a movement. But maybe that's how real change begins, quietly. Through one honest act. One bold reclaiming. A year after reclaiming her home, a local university invited Nora to give a commencement address to its graduating social work students. She stood behind the podium, hair neatly pinned, wearing a navy dress and the same pearl earrings Robert had given her before his last surgery. She looked out over hundreds of eager, young faces. And she spoke. "You will be taught that helping others means losing sleep, sacrificing time, carrying burdens. But let me tell you something no textbook will say: your power comes from remembering your own worth. I spent most of my life thinking that to love was to become invisible. I was wrong. True love, the kind that builds legacies, is the love that refuses to shrink. The kind that lifts others without letting them climb over you. I learned that after 76 years. Don't wait that long." The room rose in a standing ovation. And Nora, once the invisible matriarch in the corner of the family photo, stood radiant in the spotlight, her presence undeniable. Now, when people pass the Copperwood Center, they see more than a building. They see a revolution wrapped in soft blue shutters and wild desert roses. They see proof that aging doesn't mean fading. They see Nora, not as a burden, not as a sweet little old lady, but as a pillar. A woman who once gave quietly and now leads loudly, not with volume, but with conviction. Because she finally understands that strength isn't about lifting everyone else up. Sometimes, it's about standing your ground and saying, "This is who I am. And I matter." The Arizona sky was a warm, golden flame, sunset spilling across the desert like honey, as Nora sat on her back porch, a gentle breeze tugging at the edges of her shawl. At 76, she no longer counted the years behind her with the quiet anxiety she once had. Now, each day felt deliberate. Each breath, earned. It had been a year and a half since Vivian and Craig had left the house on Silverwood Drive. The eviction process had been smooth but sobering. Legal notices. Movers. A final exchange of cold words and colder silences. Nora hadn't seen Craig since. Vivian had called once, months later, asking for time, for forgiveness, for a second chance she hadn't yet earned. Nora listened. And replied gently, "Not yet." It wasn't said in anger. It was said with boundaries, the very thing she had once believed made her selfish. Now, she knew they were sacred. Vivian and Craig had struggled. Without Nora's quiet financial support and the safety net they had once taken for granted, their lifestyle cracked. The mortgage on their new downsized home collapsed after Craig's second failed business venture. They moved into a modest rental on the outskirts of Chandler. Tyler, meanwhile, chose a different path. He had graduated from Arizona State that spring with honors in public administration. Instead of heading straight into grad school, he asked Nora if he could volunteer full-time at the Copperwood Center. "I want to learn what real community leadership looks like," he said, smiling. Nora had simply raised an eyebrow. "And you think I'm the one to teach you that?" "You're the only one who taught me anything that stuck," he replied. It was Tyler who brought in the grant writers, who organized the fundraising gala that drew donors and city leaders, who redesigned the center's website and made Nora a video series called Wisdom Wednesdays, short clips of her answering questions from the elderly community on everything from retirement anxiety to how to deal with adult children who forget your birthday. It was also Tyler who showed up every Friday morning with 2 cappuccinos, sitting beside Nora at her desk like a coworker, even though, technically, she was still the boss. "Why don't you go live your life, Tyler?" she asked him once, half joking. "Date, travel, fall in love." He shrugged. "I will. But I have time. You didn't, for a long while. I want to help buy some of that time back." One of Nora's most cherished days came that winter, under a canvas tent filled with heaters and laughter. The Copperwood Center had reached its 1-year anniversary. Dozens of seniors gathered, many of them now regulars, holding mugs of cider, singing to Grace's piano, laughing at Hank's terrible woodworking puns. And in the middle of it all, Nora stood next to a mural on the side of the house. It had been painted by students from a local high school art program. It showed an older woman standing in a desert landscape, her arms stretched wide like tree branches, sheltering a crowd beneath them. Children, elderly, men, women, all under her care. At the bottom, in bold brush strokes, were the words, "You are not done yet." Nora couldn't speak when she saw it. She just put a hand to her chest and nodded. 1 week later, she received a letter from Vivian. Handwritten. No preamble. "Dear Mom, I know I don't deserve another chance. But I'm writing to tell you that I've been going to counseling. That I've been reflecting on what we did and why. I blamed you for so much, your strength, your silence, even your generosity, because I wasn't ready to see how small I had become. I know it might take years for you to trust me again. I don't want anything from you. I just want you to know. I see you now. Not as a woman in my way, but as a woman who paved mine. Vivian." Nora read it twice, then placed it in the drawer where she kept her wedding ring, her favorite photograph of Robert, and the first dollar she ever earned from her teacher's salary. She didn't respond. Not yet. Healing had its own pace. On the first day of spring, Nora stood in front of a full auditorium at the state's Elder Advocacy Conference. She was the keynote speaker. Her talk was titled, "The Power of Saying No, How Boundaries Became My Freedom." She spoke without notes, told the story not as a victim but as a woman who had climbed out of a life that once required her to shrink in order to fit in. "I spent decades thinking love meant disappearing for others," she said. "But the truth is, love means showing up. For others, yes, but especially for yourself. You can be kind, generous, forgiving, and still draw a line in the sand." Applause filled the hall. Not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from people who see themselves in your story. Nora returned to her seat and looked at Tyler, who was beaming from the front row. "You know," he whispered, "you've got a lot of revolution left in you." She laughed. "Let's just call it clarity." In her quiet moments, sunset tea on the back porch, late-night reading by the fireplace, feeding the hummingbirds outside the sunroom, Nora felt something rare. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of having faced everything and still standing. She had faced abandonment, manipulation, entitlement. She had faced the parts of herself that let those things fester for far too long. She had faced her family and walked away whole. Now, at 76, she lived without apology. She hosted book clubs, spoke at universities, met with city leaders about elder housing reform, cooked Tyler's favorite lentil soup, listened to Hank's carpentry lessons, even though she had no intention of sawing a single piece of wood. She laughed. She rested. She belonged to herself. And every morning, she passed the mirror in her hallway, the one that used to reflect a tired woman searching for purpose, and now saw someone else entirely. A survivor, a founder, a grandmother, a warrior, and above all, a woman who never stopped learning how to love. Only now, she included herself in that love too. Nora Whitaker had always believed in quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from an empty house or a sleepy afternoon, but the kind that lives inside a person. The stillness of choosing words carefully. The strength of waiting instead of reacting. The dignity of walking away when the noise around you turns cruel. It had served her well. For 76 years, her silence had been her shield, through raising a headstrong daughter, managing a chaotic school staff, and later, enduring the hollowing experience of watching the people she loved treat her like an afterthought. But if there was one thing Nora had come to understand, it was this. Silence can be mistaken for submission. Kindness can be misread as weakness. And worth, real human worth, is not found in deeds done quietly, but in the power behind those choices. The betrayal by her daughter and son-in-law had cut deeply, not just for what they had done, but for why they had done it. They hadn't asked. They hadn't wondered. They had simply assumed. They looked at her age, her gray hair, her small handwriting, and decided she was done. That she was fading. That her property and possessions were better managed by younger, more capable hands. They had built a narrative in which she was no longer the teacher, the leader, the matriarch. She was a burden. A vault of resources. A shadow of who she used to be. But they forgot something crucial. Nora had allowed herself to be quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was listening. Not because she was powerless, but because she was watching. And when the time came, she rose, not with anger, but with action. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove herself right. She remembered sitting alone the night she signed the eviction papers. Not with glee, not with vengeance, but with the weight of a truth long overdue. She whispered aloud, "You don't get to define me by what I give or what I own. I define me." The lamp cast a warm glow across the hardwood. Her late husband's photo smiled back at her from the shelf. She took comfort in the memory of his favorite phrase. "The strongest people I've known were the ones who didn't shout their power, they showed it when it mattered most." And that's exactly what Nora had done. The transformation that followed wasn't flashy. It wasn't viral. It didn't come with applause or headlines, at least not at first. It was a shift from internal to external. From survival to service. From quiet sacrifice to empowered giving. She founded the Copperwood Center, not to prove a point, but to fulfill a purpose. To show that the value of a person, especially an older person, doesn't fade with age. It evolves, deepens, becomes more rooted. Through conversations with lonely widows, workshops with retired veterans, and afternoons teaching tech to women who hadn't used a smartphone in their lives, Nora unearthed a revelation. So many seniors had been taught to disappear, to give, to defer, to surrender their space at the table. But Nora had built a new table, and pulled up chairs for every forgotten voice. One moment stood out most. During a Copperwood writing class, a woman named Eloise, 83, read aloud a letter she had written to her younger self. Her voice trembled but didn't break. "You will love people who don't love you back. You will keep homes warm for those who never say thank you. And one day, you will learn that your worth was never in what you gave away, but in what you refused to let go of." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Nora reached over, held Eloise's hand, and nodded. Because in Eloise's letter, she heard her own story echo back. The world had changed around Nora, yes, but more importantly, she had changed within it. She no longer believed that being good meant staying silent. She no longer confused politeness with peace. And most of all, she no longer waited for others to validate her worth. She lived on her own terms, gracious, sharp, and grounded. She smiled more freely, spoke with more intention. And when people thanked her for what she'd created, she didn't brush it off like she once would have. Now, she simply said, "You're welcome," and meant it. So what's the lesson? It isn't just that betrayal can happen closest to home. It isn't just that family can fail you, and love can come with strings. It's that your value, your voice, isn't theirs to measure. You are not the sum of the things you give. You are not a dollar sign. You are not a name on a deed. You are not a chapter someone else gets to write. You are your own story. And sometimes, the most powerful part of that story is the moment you stop asking for a seat and start building your own table. Real-life application, 150 words. If you're reading Nora's story and seeing pieces of yourself in her, you're not alone. Maybe you've been overlooked. Maybe you've been taken for granted by your family, coworkers, or even by yourself. Maybe you've convinced yourself that staying quiet was the noble path, until silence began to eat at your dignity. But like Nora, you are allowed to change the rules. Start with one boundary. Speak one truth. Claim one space. And remember, you do not owe your silence to anyone who confuses it for permission. There is strength in stillness, but there's also power in knowing when to rise. Because the world doesn't need more quiet suffering. It needs your story, told your way, on your terms.